The sentence didn't land like a policy announcement. It landed like a detonation. When the President of the United States stood in front of cameras and said America doesn't need Canada, doesn't need its cars, doesn't need its energy, doesn't need its resources, something fundamental cracked, not because it was provocative, not because it was insulting, but because it was demonstrably false in ways that threaten the physical systems that keep this country functioning. Most people heard the line, shrugged, and scrolled. Another Trump statement, another performative flex, another day. But that's how normalization works. It turns structural danger into background noise. And what that sentence actually represents isn't rhetoric. It's a direct collision between fantasy and infrastructure. Because North America doesn't run on slogans. It runs on pipelines, refineries, rail lines, power grids, mineral supply chains, legal agreements, and decades of synchronized investment. And when you threaten to tear one of those apart, the damage doesn't arrive in speeches. It arrives at gas pumps, power bills, grocery aisles, factory floors, and defense production lines. This is not about diplomacy. It's about physics, economics, and law. Start with energy, because that's where reality hits fastest and hardest. Every single day, millions of barrels of crude oil cross from Canada into the United States, not as a favor, not as charity, as a structural necessity. A majority of the crude oil the U.S. imports comes from one place, Canada. And here's the part that shatters the talking point. The United States is the world's largest oil producer, yet it still depends on Canadian crude because American refineries were engineered, very deliberately, to process heavy crude, not the lighter oil produced in most U.S. fields. This isn't theoretical. Refineries are not interchangeable machines. They are custom-built industrial organisms designed for specific chemical properties. The heavy crude that flows out of Alberta fits those systems. Take it away, and you don't just flip a switch to replace it. You shut facilities down. There are refineries in the Midwest that run almost entirely on Canadian crude. If that supply stops, they don't operate at reduced capacity. They go dark. No gradual adjustment. No easy substitute. And retooling those facilities would take years and cost tens of billions of dollars. So when a president says America doesn't need Canadian energy, what he's really saying is that the engineers, economists, and planners who designed the U.S. energy system for the last half-century were wrong, and that his instinct overrides the math. Now follow that downstream, because oil doesn't just disappear quietly. If Canadian crude were disrupted, gasoline prices wouldn't inch up over time. They would jump fast, within weeks. Energy economists have been clear about this. 30 to 70 cents per gallon almost immediately. And that's before panic buying, market speculation, or geopolitical shockwaves amplify the effect. That's not abstract pain. That's every commuter, every delivery driver, every small business, every family on a fixed income feeling it at once. And that's only the opening act, because oil is just one piece. Natural gas tells an even more uncomfortable story. Nearly all of the natural gas the United States imports through pipelines comes from Canada. Those pipelines weren't built accidentally. They were constructed over decades under the assumption that Canadian gas flows south, while American gas flows to export terminals and other markets. The entire system is engineered around that balance. In regions like New England, New York, and the upper Midwest, Canadian natural gas isn't a luxury. It's the backbone of winter heating, electricity generation, and industrial activity. When temperatures drop and demand spikes, that Canadian supply is the difference between stability and rolling blackouts. And no, you don't replace that overnight with renewables. Even experts who champion clean energy are clear on this point. If hydroelectric imports from Canada are cut, states don't magically fill the gap with wind and solar. They burn more fossil fuels, dirtier fuels, more expensive fuels. Emissions rise, costs rise, reliability drops, which means a single destabilizing statement doesn't just threaten energy security. It undercuts climate strategies that states have spent decades trying to build. It forces backward movement at precisely the moment when forward momentum matters most. Now zoom out, because energy is only one artery in a much larger circulatory system. Most Americans have never heard the phrase critical minerals, but modern life collapses without them. The U.S. government officially classifies 50 minerals as critical to economic and national security. For a significant number of those, the United States is heavily import-dependent, and Canada is one of the primary suppliers. These minerals aren't optional. They're inputs for fertilizer, steel, batteries, electronics, medical equipment, and weapons systems. Potash from Canada underpins American agriculture. Without it, fertilizer production drops, crop yields fall, and food prices rise. Uranium from Canada feeds American nuclear reactors, which supply roughly a fifth of the nation's electricity. No uranium means no nuclear power. No nuclear power means higher emissions and higher costs. Nickel, zinc, vanadium, tellurium, materials that sound obscure until you realize they're embedded in everything from construction to renewable energy to advanced manufacturing. For many of these, Canada supplies the majority of U.S. demand. And then there are rare earth elements, 17 metals that are essential to modern defense systems and high-tech manufacturing. Fighter jets, missile guidance systems, electric vehicle motors, advanced electronics, none of it works without rare earths. Right now, China dominates that market. The United States has been trying desperately to diversify away from Chinese control because depending on a strategic competitor for defense-critical materials is a national security risk. Canada was supposed to be a central pillar of that alternative. Canadian mining paired with American processing, a North American solution to a global vulnerability. That strategy collapses the moment you turn your most reliable partner into an adversary. We've already seen how fragile these systems are. A limited export restriction from China recently sent shockwaves through American manufacturing. Auto plants slowed or halted production because they couldn't get the rare earth magnets needed for basic components. One disruption, one country, weeks of chaos. Now imagine choosing to destabilize the country that was supposed to help you escape that dependency. That's not strength. That's self-sabotage. And the damage doesn't stop at minerals or energy. It hits manufacturing next, and nowhere is that more visible than the auto industry. The US-Canada automotive supply chain is so integrated that the concept of a foreign part is almost meaningless. A single vehicle assembled in Michigan might cross the border half a dozen times during production. Engines, transmissions, electronics, safety systems, they move back and forth in a choreography refined over generations. This isn't inefficiency, it's optimization. It reduces costs, improves quality, and allows manufacturers to specialize at a scale that makes modern vehicles affordable. Tariffs, trade barriers, or political threats don't just raise prices. They force companies to dismantle and rebuild entire production ecosystems. That takes years. It costs billions. And during that transition, jobs vanish on both sides of the border. There's a phrase supply chain experts use for systems like this. You can't unscramble an egg. Once the integration exists, tearing it apart doesn't restore some imagined independence. It creates chaos. And all of this sits inside a legal framework that was designed to prevent exactly this kind of instability. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement was negotiated to lock in rules, reduce uncertainty, and give businesses confidence to invest. It replaced NAFTA not to undo integration, but to modernize it. It was supposed to say, these relationships are stable, predictable, and governed by law. When the same president who signed that agreement turns around and undermines its spirit through threats, tariffs, or fantasies of annexation, the legal signal is unmistakable. Agreements are provisional, commitments are temporary. Stability depends on mood. Markets despise that. Investment doesn't flow where rules are optional. Capital doesn't commit where contracts can be shredded by impulse. Businesses don't build factories or supply chains around a partner they can't trust, and trust is exactly what's evaporating. The rhetoric has gone far beyond trade disputes. It has crossed into open talk of absorbing Canada as a state, of mocking elected leaders by calling them governors, of posting images that redraw borders as if sovereignty were a joke. Canadian public opinion has responded with clarity, overwhelming opposition, near universal rejection, not just from one party, but across the political spectrum. Liberals, conservatives, progressives, all aligned around one message: this is unacceptable. And that rejection matters because relationships aren't sustained by economics alone. They're sustained by legitimacy, by consent, by the understanding that cooperation is voluntary, not coerced. When that disappears, countries adapt. Canada is already diversifying, not because it wants to, because it has to. When your largest trading partner becomes unpredictable, you reduce exposure, you seek alternatives, you hedge risk. That process doesn't reverse easily. Once supply chains shift, once investments are made elsewhere, once trust is broken, it doesn't snap back into place when rhetoric changes. Now let's be clear about something, because nuance matters. No trade relationship is perfect. Disputes over dairy, lumber, and market access are real. Border security is a legitimate concern, Negotiation is part of any healthy economic partnership. But there is a difference between negotiation and destabilization, between leverage and arson, between pressing for better terms and threatening the entire structure that keeps both sides afloat. What we're witnessing is not hard-nosed bargaining. It's a pattern of behavior that treats interdependence as weakness rather than reality, that frames mutual reliance as humiliation rather than strength, that confuses dominance with security. And this pattern doesn't exist in isolation. It mirrors how institutions are treated domestically. Courts are attacked when they constrain. Laws are dismissed when they inconvenience. Agreements are honored only when they flatter. That's the authoritarian playbook. Undermine trust, degrade norms, replace systems with personality. But systems are what make a modern nation function. Here's what happens if those systems fracture. Gas prices spike quickly. Heating costs rise in winter-heavy regions. Electricity prices climb, and grid reliability suffers. Manufacturing slows as parts become scarce or more expensive. Auto prices increase. Delivery times stretch. Defense production encounters bottlenecks. Food prices rise as fertilizer costs jump. Tech manufacturing stumbles as mineral shortages ripple through supply chains. None of this arrives with a dramatic announcement. It shows up quietly, relentlessly, in household budgets and national capability. And all of it happens while the United States is already navigating competition with China, managing alliances in Europe, and trying to maintain global leadership. Allies watch how America treats its closest partner. They take notes. They ask themselves whether commitments mean anything, whether agreements endure beyond election cycles, whether American power is anchored in law or personality. Because if it's the latter, cooperation becomes a gamble. This is how influence erodes, not with a single catastrophic decision, but with repeated signals that reliability is optional. And here's the deepest irony of all: the claim of independence, the insistence that America doesn't need anyone, the performance of self-sufficiency. It collapses under inspection. 4 million barrels of oil per day say otherwise. Power grids say otherwise. Auto plants say otherwise. Defense planners say otherwise. Farmers say otherwise. Engineers say otherwise. Interdependence is not a flaw. It's the foundation of modern prosperity. The question isn't whether America depends on Canada. It's whether that dependence is managed intelligently or weaponized recklessly. Because when interdependence is weaponized, both sides bleed. And once trust is gone, rebuilding it is far harder than destroying it. So when you hear a line like, "We don't need Canada," understand what it really is. It's not a statement of strength. It's a warning flare that the person speaking either doesn't understand the machinery of the modern economy or doesn't care what happens when it breaks. Reality doesn't negotiate. Pipelines don't respond to bravado. Supply chains don't bend to rhetoric. Eventually, reality collects its debt. The only open question is how much damage is done before that bill comes due. This isn't the last chapter in this story. It's the setup. And when the consequences arrive, they won't announce themselves as political events. They'll arrive as price spikes, shortages, delays, and strategic vulnerability. And by then, it will be far too late to pretend no one warned us. This isn't about liking or disliking a country. It's about whether the United States remains a serious nation that understands how power actually works. If this analysis helped you see what's really underneath the headlines, not the theater but the structure, stay with me. When the next move happens, you'll want to understand what you're seeing before the damage is already locked in. Subscribe so you're not caught off guard when it matters most.